Hello, welcome everyone. Happy Tuesday. Thank you all for taking some time and joining us for Beyond the Basics of A/B Tests, highly innovative experimentation tactics you need to know, presented by Data Science Current and sponsored by Statsig. I'm Tara, the webinar manager of Data Science Current, and I am really excited to bring you this brand new session with such well-earned insight into the limitations of traditional A/B testing and advanced techniques to really take your experimentation to the next level. I am really looking forward to hearing from Timothy Chan today and what I'm sure will be a valuable presentation. And as a reminder, we will be recording this webinar in case you need to leave early. If you happen to miss any part of the webinar, you can go to the registration page to access the recording after today's event. We're going to send that link across in the chat for you right now. Up next, before we go any further, I do want to stop and thank Statsig for sponsoring this webinar and helping us to make it all happen. Statsig is the leading product experimentation platform that helps businesses use data to ship fast and build better products. Companies like Microsoft, Figma, Notion, Flipkart, Eventbrite, Ancestry, Headspace, and Univision use Statsig to manage feature rollouts, automate experiments, and make decisions based on performance metrics. Founded in 2021 by former Facebook engineers, Statsig supports thousands of experiments impacting over 1 billion end users globally. Statsig democratizes experimentation, an essential aspect of reducing development risk and previously only accessible to big tech companies. You can learn more at statsig.com. So thank you again to Statsig. Up next, let's go ahead and quickly get some technical things out of the way. Please don't hesitate to ask questions during today's event. You can do so by submitting your questions into the Q&A panel found in the bottom toolbar of this window. Great questions always make for great discussion, so don't forget to stick around for our Q&A session near the end of the hour to get even more insights and advice from our panelists. The chat is also available for open discussion and comments, but please just keep in mind we will be using the Q&A panel to answer specific questions so we don't lose them. My wonderful colleague Tori will be fielding all of your questions today. She'll be happy to answer anything technical you might have while you're here. And please feel free to pull up the chat or the Q&A, say hello, let us know where you're joining from today. Closed captioning is also available for this webinar. And to enable this feature, select the Show Captions button in the bottom toolbar of this window. And lastly, if you have any audio issues during today's presentation, you may choose to dial in by phone. All dial-in information can be found in your webinar confirmation email from Zoom. It is on screen and Tori can relay it to you at any point if you need it. With all of that out of the way, again, today I am so excited to hear from Timothy Chan. Tim is an experienced data science professional currently serving as the data science lead at Statsig, which provides product observability and experimentation services to top companies such as Notion, Rec Room, Univision, and Ancestry. Before joining Statsig, Tim spent 5 years as a data scientist at Facebook, now Meta, where he was involved in building products across Facebook app and Reality Labs. And before venturing into tech, Tim worked in biotech, researching treatments for diseases such as Alzheimer's, MS, lupus, and cancer. He holds a PhD in chemistry and an MBA in entrepreneurship. So without further ado, I'm going to turn everything over to you, Tim.
Thank you so much, Tara. Much appreciated. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Most folks, probably good afternoon. Really thank you for attending this talk. This is a topic, what I'm going to share with you today is something I'm pretty passionate about. The inspiration behind this talk is really that A/B testing is becoming widely recognized as a powerful tool in product development. And as it becomes a standard, there's more and more information you can find online, but most of it is really covering the basics. And there's not a lot of information about the advanced stuff, which I think is actually pretty cool. And I really wanted to share. And so I've kind of cobbled them together in this talk to get some of your creative juices going on what experimentation can do when it runs into some harder, more difficult challenges. Um, uh, you heard a little bit about my background. I switched from biotech into tech, and not just any tech. It was at Facebook at the time. And so I had seen experimentation when I was in biotech on sample sizes as small as handfuls or dozens. And then when I went all the way to tech, I was seeing experimentation work at the billions. And then in between and even afterwards, I've seen it all throughout the spectrum of sample sizes. And so when folks tell me they don't have enough users to run an experiment, I tell them that is probably incorrect and that they need to be looking at other metrics or other experiments. That's one of the biggest myths, and I'll talk a little bit about that further. I do want to talk a little bit about my company, Statsig. We were founded more than 3 years ago. We're a scrappy team, but growing, and we're based out of as you can see in my background, the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're famous for our 100% in-person office culture. We're also a dog-friendly office. This photo was taken more than a year ago, but I'm saving it here in the slide deck because I'm sitting in the front center with my dog, Parker, who lucked out, and it just happened to be company photo day on a day he came to the office. Statsig is an experimentation and feature flagging platform that powers companies like Notion, Figma, and OpenAI. We help teams manage their feature rollups, set up experiments, and provide results. And in general, we make it really easy to be data-driven. We have two products, Statsig Cloud, where we process your experimental results, and that is currently processing 200 billion events across all of our customers each day. That's powering the 20,000 experiments stat you heard across more than 1 billion unique user identifiers. We also have Statsig Warehouse Native. This is where you get the full power of Statsig Cloud, but the compute happens within your data warehouse and the raw data never leaves. So in this talk, I will review the basics just to make sure we're all on the same page. Just what is A/B testing, why it's so powerful, why it's becoming best practice in product development, and how experimentation really is the foundation for building a data-driven culture. Then I'll dive into what I'm calling Experimentation 201. This is some of the more popular and advanced tactics. And we're going to cover a wide variety of these things, everything from switchback experiments, stratified sampling, and even meta-analysis. But let's start with the 101. There are many tools in the experiment product analytics toolbox, but all of them that I can think of are correlation-based analyses. Usually you're observing some metric A, you're finding how it relates to B. For example, you may be slicing your user base and finding out that different mobile devices are correlated to retention. Experimentation, however, is different than all of these tools. It actually measures causation. Experimentation is the basis of the scientific method and the gold standard for measuring causality. And this is where data-driven decision-making starts. If we do A, we know B will happen, and by about X%. Data can trump opinions, but you have to collect it first. Skeptics will criticize this and say they don't need A/B testing. They hire smart people, a lot of smart people. And these people we hire because they have good product sense and intuition. So they're going to make the right decision, right? But the truth is that even among top tech companies, only a third of all ideas work. And this has been thoroughly, this has been published work that has been thoroughly reproduced by a lot of other top tech companies such as Airbnb, Microsoft, Google. And it turns out that intuition is often wrong. Now, why would that be? Well, this is simple. It's because building products is fundamentally hard. And even if your intuition is good or you got lucky, experimentation still lets you quantify the impact while producing richer insights by diving into your experimental results. And if you're, here's how experimentation works, in case you're not familiar. You have a group of users, your user base, and your user base will be heterogeneous. Not all the users are identical. There's no two people who are the same in this world. And the first thing that experimentation does is it will randomly assign users into two groups. This part is very critical for experimentation. Randomization is the secret sauce and why all of this works. Because if you have enough users, it'll produce two equal and comparable groups. For example, if your user base has 10% of power users, it'll make sure that both the test and control group are approximately 10% comprised of each. Essentially, your power users have been split equally. And this is the same thing for all of the other user traits that you may be worried about. For example, what percentage of your users are on iOS or are using an iPhone. We'll make sure that that's balanced for that. We'll make sure that the new users are split evenly. It'll make sure that your male-female gender ratio is also accounted for in both groups. And it basically keeps it so that the two assignment groups are equal and comparable. The really cool thing, though, is that it doesn't just control for all the known confounding variables, it also controls for all unknown factors. For example, uh, what happens if you are an e-commerce company and Amazon is running an experiment and half of those users on Amazon are getting a discount? Well, it'll make sure that those users are split evenly here. What happens if you are a meal delivery service and half your users had a burrito for breakfast? It'll make sure that's accounted for here. So it does a very effective job of correcting for all factors, known and unknown. And now since we have two equal and comparable groups, we can then subject them to this two different experiences often called the test and the control. This is done over the exact same time period, so we're also accounting for seasonal effects, and so that it affects them both equally. If you are doing this over a Black Friday, you're making sure that both test and control are equally affected by the Black Friday. And what that means is that if we've got two groups that are equal and comparable, ran over the same time period that is equal and comparable, any differences we observe, there's only one variable we changed here, and it's the treatment, the test and control. So any differences we observe can be attributed to this difference. This is fundamental. This is the underpinnings of causality and why we can draw strong inferences from this experiment. So if we did X to one group and not the other, and we find out that purchases are up 5%, we know the reason why. There are a lot of ways to get this process wrong, and I've just got a short list of the ones that come up the most often. First is you should always start with hypothesis. A lot of people just like to run an experiment, then they look at the results afterwards and they're not really sure what they're looking for, or they're trying to explain what they see after the fact. That's the wrong way to approach this. You should absolutely know what you're changing and what you expect to happen. And it's best practice to have this explicitly stated up front. You should focus on your primary effect. This is the first observable metric you expect to change, the one that's most directly related to what you've changed. For example, if you shorten your signup flow, maybe you expect more signups to happen. But you should also ask yourself to go a little bit deeper. What else can happen? Will users spend more time spent? Will they be sharing invites out? What could go wrong? What critical business metrics might change, and why should your business leaders care? All of this should be included in your scorecard. Next, you'll want to run a power analysis. This lets you estimate how many users you need to detect the result or effect that you expect. This ensures your experiments have a reasonable chance of succeeding. It'll also guide how many users and for how long you need to run this experiment for. I do recommend standardizing your methodology across all experiments company-wide. You will want to use the same stats, the same metric sources, and the same decision-making framework. This ensures results are comparable between experiments. This makes sure that teams are speaking the same language, and that business leaders can compare. If one team says they lifted revenue 2% by making a change, and another team says that they lifted revenue by 3%, you know those numbers are comparable. I am a big fan of using 95% confidence intervals by default. Now, while there are certainly many good reasons to increase or decrease this threshold, unless you are able to clearly articulate these reasons before you run an experiment, I would stick with 95%. It is a very practical threshold that has stood the test of time. It makes running successful experiments actually achievable while maintaining a reasonably low false positive rate. And I usually find most folks who question 95% are doing it after they're looking at their results. Finally, the last thing, and this one comes up quite a bit, is don't fret about interaction effects. This is where experiments can collide and interfere with each other. There's a lot of research out there that shows that interaction effects are fairly rare, and even when they do occur, they often won't result in different decisions. And ultimately, if you wanted to try to address interaction effects, it means carving up your experiments, dividing your user base into groups, running experiments sequentially. This is experimental poison. This reduces your sample size, reduces your pace of experimentation, and slows down your company's rate of innovation. All right, I want to introduce a character. This is affectionately known as the Hippo. Hippo is short. It's an acronym for highest paid person's opinion. And it's how many businesses, at least in the old days, used to make decisions. Some businesses are doing this today. It's what you do when you aren't data-driven. I've learned that experimentation is a great antidote for this. The reason why is it produces concrete and simple facts. Things like this feature increases retention by 2%, or that recommendation model reduced revenue by 3%. It's really hard to ignore data like this because it's a causal statement. This helps companies become grounded in the data. And usually when you want to argue against such a statement, you have to bring in additional data. Now, I know you're hoping to dive into the more advanced stuff, and I will get into that, but I do want to just pause here and focus on something that matters a lot to me. It's really important for your company to focus on experimentation culture rather than fancy statistics. The focus is the best experimentation programs I've seen focus more on people and processes and less on the math. It needs to be trivial for an engineer to set up, execute, and analyze a simple A/B test. You should also be focusing on democratizing data. Everyone on the product team, whether it's PMs, engineers, or data scientists, should be involved. This is a team sport. Experimental review is a critical part of a company's data culture. The scientific method was designed to invite questioning. And we find that when you bring your team together and in the form of a review, this is where discussions can take place. It's where assumptions are challenged and where knowledge and best practices are shared. And it's how you train the next generation of experimentalists. And lastly, your company should be optimizing for velocity. Always focus on velocity. You need to find ways to remove friction so that more ideas are tested. This is a competitive advantage for the folks who are doing this at the fastest pace. All right, with all that said, welcome to Experimentation 201. I'm going to cover some of the more popular ways to address some of the limitations of standard A/B testing. The first method I'll talk about here is called Cupid. This is fairly well known. Some folks here probably know of it. Cupid is short for controlled experiments using pre-experimental data. That's a mouthful. It was popularized by Microsoft for use in online experimentation in 2013. It is a variance reduction technique, and it acknowledges that not all variance that you see in your data is purely random, that there's a lot of variation that can be explained using pre-experimental data. For example, user level information is often affected by what those attributes of the user or what they did before the experiment. Give an example, and this is not an online example, but I think it's one that's very easy to conceptualize. Let's say you're a car dealership and you want to predict how expensive of a car a prospective buyer is going to be looking at. Now, if you were to look at all the cars in your dealership, you'll find out that you've got some used cars that are as low as $1,000 and some luxury sports cars that could be over 100K. That's a high variance, and it's really hard to predict. But what happens if you knew the type of car that the person drove into the dealership with, or perhaps what car they've bought previously? I bet you that correlates very well with the car that they're looking at. If you account for this variability, you can actually reduce the variance you see in your estimate. In real-world online examples for across a variety of metrics, actually across Statsig experiments using real metrics and real experiments, we see that Cupid can result in a 30 to 6% reduction in variance. This results in faster experiments, smaller sample sizes, and more precise decision making. There's a few considerations. First is that its effectiveness is limited based on the information you have on these users. If you have new users, you obviously don't have any historical information, and so it's going to be less effective. You can rely on user attributes for this, but that's not as predictive as prior metrics history. All right. The next problem I want to talk about is something affectionately known as the winner's curse. This is where it's a phenomenon where the estimates from A/B tests don't quite live up to the hype. And this happens over and over and over again to the point where people start to question their experimental results. I'll give an example. We've had a customer whose former experimentation tool, if they added up all of the experiments they shipped, they found out that they would be up 40% on revenue. That's great, right? Really successful. But the problem is that their top line revenue for the year was only up 10%. Trying to dive into this sort of discrepancy is a great way to lose trust in your experimentation tooling. But there are many reasons that the winner's curse is just going to happen naturally. First is long-term sustainability. Are the metric lifts you're finding in your experiments actually holding up over time? Or are you just looking at novelty effects? The solution to that is to run your experiments longer or wait for your metrics to stabilize so that you can have confidence that the lifts you're seeing are durable. Next reason that could cause this is underpowered experiments. If you are short on users and time, you will be tempted to underpower your experiments. While what happens is that this can lead to a large amount of statistical error in your lift estimates. The example I'll show here is illustrated by this chart. The null hypothesis is shown in black. This is what distribution you're pulling the experimental results from if there were no effect. We take this black line and set a threshold for rejecting a null hypothesis at a p-value of 0.05. That is where that's where the green shading starts on that black spectrum. Now, if you have a good experiment that's confidently above this threshold, as illustrated in green, you will be able to pull a value from the green distribution. You'll see on average the green distribution is well above this threshold, so this experiment is fairly well powered. But if you were to take but it has a chance of resulting in a false negative. There's a small probability that it will be below, but on average, it's going to be above. If you were to take the average, this weight of the value you would observe from the green, it's going to be a little bit over the actual true effect. So most effects that you see for well-powered experiments, for underpowered experiments are going to have a wide error margin here. Another reason is false positives. This is where you don't actually have an experimental lift, and the test group is the same as the control. So we're pulling from the black distribution. There's a 5% chance we'll get something in the green. That's obviously another case where we have an experimental result that we just got lucky with, and it's not actually that good. And there's a 5% chance of this happening when you set your threshold at 95%. So there's no lift. Next is overestimations. If your experimental effect is not quite above the threshold, but it's still good, you have a chance of declaring this a winner. Not reliably, but you do have a chance. So this isn't bad because in the end, the decision you'll make is you're still shipping a win, but you'll overestimate this for sure. And lastly, and this one is not talked about because it's not mentioned as much because it's not a statistical problem. It's a human problem. There's a human error that can often come in that leads to biases in how you make decisions. We tend to look at results with rose-colored glasses and can sometimes cherry-pick results. This means sometimes an experiment could just plain be bad. So I've shown that in the red distribution, and the results are bad. But we have ways as humans to ignore these and ship anyways. I'll give a few real examples that we have seen. Perhaps you have a scorecard, perhaps you have a metric, and it's showing a negative result. You may start to dive into, well, maybe something's wrong with that metric. Maybe it's flawed. Maybe the logging is bad. And then you will investigate that and look to replace it with a better metric. But if the result were green, you would not do that such an investigation. All of this can lose trust in your experimentation. And what it leads to is that people will start to game the system. It's a very simple solution to this. And it's holdouts. A lot of companies that are running large-scale experimentation program are using holdouts. It's a very powerful tool. What a holdout is where you have a small subset of users that are intentionally withheld from a treatment, even after you've made a decision and intend to roll it out fully. And this is typically done over a long-term period, for example, more than 3 months. And there are many uses for this. One is that you can get exquisite accuracy and precision in the long-term effect, and be able to estimate the long-term effect. A famous example was that Meta had published results from a notifications holdout. Notifications are those annoying alerts that hit your phone and tell you to play, hey, take a look at the app. And sometimes they can contain useful information, and sometimes they can just contain spam. In the app world, notifications are known to be a great way to drive up engagement with your app and remind your users that your app exists and might have something new to see. And whenever you run a notification experiment, or say most of the time you run one, you will find that it will lead to an increase in engagement. This is why apps use notifications a lot. But when Meta ran a long-term holdout, what they started to see was that they saw a lift in the short-term results, but as they monitored that holdout where they withheld notifications from a small percentage of users, was they found that after was that they found over is that you get short-term engagement. It's up. Sorry, if you withhold the holdout results, withhold notifications from those users, engagement is down. But over time, and that time being 11 to 12 months, engagement is actually up in the long term. Users actually prefer having less notifications. The second use for these are being able to come up with cumulative estimates. So when you have multiple experiments that you're shipping, ideally with the same hypothesis or similar ones, it's a great way to combine those together. So if you are trying to drive up revenue for your company, you may put a long-term holdout for a revenue for those experiments behind it, and you can actually quantify what happens if do experiments A, B, and C actually add up. It's 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, or maybe it's equal to 2 or 1.5. This is a good way to do it. Helps you evaluate how much you're overestimating those wins. It'll let you know how good those wins combined actually are and whether your decision-making framework at your company is correct. Holdouts are also a great way to do a re-roll of the randomization process, sort of like getting a second opinion. There are many ways to use a holdout. You can use them for performance reviews, or for understanding how well to resource a team, and for keeping teams honest. Because if you know that this experiment is going to be measured in a holdout, you may be more careful with the decisions you make. It's also really powerful as a debugging tool. I won't get into this, but sudden outages and metric movements can be quickly isolated to the set of features that are causing it by analyzing a network of holdouts. There are a lot of downsides, and these aren't talked about too much. First is that holdouts are deceptively expensive. Engineering teams actually have to maintain 2 branches of code and support them. And if you don't do it right, you'll actually contaminate the holdout. My advice, make sure that holdouts always have top level buy-in from leadership. And make sure you're reading out holdouts at a fixed cadence. This ensures you got visibility, also ensures you're extracting utility from this data. Because if you don't have that, you should ask yourself, why are we actually running this? And is it worth the burden? Next up is called the peaking problem. The standard hypothesis test that we've all learned in school is based on stats that generate a 5% false positive rate on a single observation. This is done typically at the end of the experiment when you've hit full power. The problem is we've been telling our teams, which consists of product managers and engineers, to be data-driven. We'll usually have dashboards up there showing them live metrics of how their product is doing. We've trained our orgs to be monitoring data live. And so when you do this in the context of an experiment, your team now wants to see experimental results as soon as they've hit the launch button. And watching how your experiment is going is simply human nature. There are plenty of good reasons you want to peak though, other than curiosity. First, maybe you want to find wins and lock them in early. The other one is you might want to detect regressions in order to abort your experiments. If your new feature is driving up a large number of crashes, you may want to abort. And the next one is for finding issues live during an experiment and actually fixing them. If you are driving crashes up, maybe a one-line code fix can quickly fix that and you can patch this issue in flight. There are practical considerations when trying to solve the peaking problem, and all of this makes the stats hard. First is how often are you going to look at results? What's the schedule? And when you see a result, how severe does it need to be for you to actually make a decision? How will you ensure you're optimizing for long-term effects and not just overreacting to novelty effects? And lastly, how do you adjust for multiple metrics? Usually decision-making is a little bit more nuanced and doesn't boil down to a single metric. Most folks like to understand multiple metrics and understand the trade-offs. If you're YouTube, you may want to understand the trade-off between ad load, revenue, and engagement. The solution to this is a statistical technique called sequential testing. This allows you to account for continuous or periodic monitoring. There are many methods that all fall under this umbrella, and all of them pose trade-offs between factors like statistical power, sensitivity, basically can they detect a real effect early, and speed. Statsig ourselves, we ended up selecting MSPRT after careful evaluation using real data across hundreds of experiments and thousands of metrics. MSPRT has the added advantage of not requiring a tuning parameter. There's another problem. What if your new ranking model is generating a ton of clicks early and sequential testing is saying this is a statistically significant result? Should you ship early? Well, what about your guardrail metrics? What if revenue, which matters most to your company, is showing 0% plus or minus 5%? Is that okay? Is it okay that you actually might be causing a regression, but you don't know? Our recommendation is to use sequential testing to identify regressions that are worthy of aborting. But if you're thinking of shipping this feature, you should really wait for the full duration of the experiment to complete, so that way you can fully evaluate all your metrics. This gives you full statistical power across your scorecard. I personally really like this model because it acknowledges the human nature of rooting for your experiment. And so what this does is it gives you permission to abort early if you see bad results, but you must be patient if you want the win. All right. Now let's talk about flaws in randomization. I mentioned this was the secret sauce in experimentation, but there are a few situations where it doesn't work well. The example I'll use here is using Canadian money. Canadian money, if you don't know, is almost exactly the same as US money, but it's got a few extra coins. For example, there's an all yellow coin that's called the loonie, and it's worth $1. And then there's a big bimetallic coin that you'll see in here. It's got the silver on the outside and the gold on the middle. This one is called the toonie because it's worth $2. And technically the penny doesn't exist anymore in Canada, but I've kept it here for this example. Now, if I take a pile of Canadian coins and just randomly split it into two groups, there's actually a 50% chance that the two toonies will end up in the same group, and I'll end up with an imbalance as shown here, where the group on the left is $5.78, the group on the right is $2.32. These are not comparable groups anymore. Why? Well, there's a couple factors playing into this. One is there's a small sample size. There's only so many coins I have here. And the second problem is that some coins are worth orders of magnitude more than other coins. Under these conditions, randomization doesn't work so well. The solution here is what we call stratified sampling. It's where you carefully balance your user base across some sort of core attributes that are correlated to their value. If you were to carefully balance these between the two groups, we can generate two equivalent groups that can be comparable and used in experimentation. You may think this is a contrived scenario, but it's not. This is a problem that affects a lot of companies in this world and affects particularly those that are in the B2B space, where you are experimenting on companies and not users. The reason why this type of business model is most affected is that they don't have millions of users. They usually have dozens or hundreds of companies. So they have smaller sample sizes. The second one is their user base, the companies are going to be very skewed distribution. If you are, let's say you are Microsoft and you're on the Microsoft Office team, you might have companies the size of IBM using you, which will consist of tens of thousands of users. And you may have some companies that are just mom and pop coffee shops that have less than 5 employees. And it's not really fair to compare those two. So B2B experiments will typically suffer from skew and small sample sizes. For example, Statsig ourselves, our user base, which is customers, has skew. If you're us, what if Atlassian and OpenAI end up in the same group? So to balance an experiment, we apply a technique called stratified sampling. Stratified sampling basically ensures that the groups are equal and comparable, and then we can analyze the results straight up that way. We can further dive into this by diving into the subgroups to understand impact across the entire user base. Another limitation, another limitation of A/B testing is fixed allocation. This is where we run a 50-50 test and hold it constant for the entire duration of the experiment. But in a lot of use cases, people are worried because this experiment may actually be expensive and the results or learnings you get may decay over time. So what happens if one of your groups is doing better than the other? Do you want to start to shift your traffic? What if time is in short supply and there's urgency to strike when the iron's hot? An example is you got a Black Friday sale, it's Friday, and in the morning you already know you have a variant that's winning. Don't you want to ship that fully, or do you want to wait for statistical significance? Generally, you don't want to wait. You want to get your winning variant out there within hours, if not minutes. Simple solution to this is multi-arm bandits. This is not like A/B testing, but it's a form of experimentation. And it's where you can adjust dynamically. And there's many different models for doing this technique. We're currently using Thompson sampling, which is a Bayesian method for estimating which one is the winner. The multi-arm bandits automatically allocate traffic without manual decision-making. It's great for situations where you have lots of variance because it does a good job of eliminating the poor performers fairly quickly. One major downside, though, is this isn't great for creating generalized learnings, nor situations where decision-making is complicated and trade-offs between metrics are unknown. Now, next problem is network effects. This is where the test and control groups can affect each other. It violates our assumption of independence. This is most commonly found in two-sided marketplaces like social networks or online marketplaces like eBay or communication platforms. So imagine if you are a ride-sharing company and want to test different rider matching algorithm. This can cause riders in one group to start booking up more rides. But it actually depletes the supply of drivers, which negatively impacts the control group. Now your two groups are affecting each other. The results you get from such a test, which is the difference between the test and control groups, will not be a true indication of what happens when you fully roll out this feature. Companies like Lyft and Uber pioneered the solution, which is called switchback testing. So instead of splitting your user base 50-50, as shown in the top chart, you actually switch time blocks randomly. So that way, all 100% of your users get test, and then they can flip over 100% get control. the entire ecosystem is being tested at once. This sort of testing also works well for infra and backend experiments where you can have network effects between nodes. There are some important considerations here. Picking the interval that you're experimenting on is going to be critical. You can switch every hour, you can switch every day, you can switch every week. You want frequent switches, so you've got a lot of observations and power, but you'll want to pick a time interval that actually allows the ecosystem to fully stabilize and result in trustworthy measurements. Next up is heterogeneous treatment effects. In A/B testing, we measure the average treatment effect, but we know there's no such thing as the average user. A major software company shared with me a story how they ran a sign-up flow test, and it generated a small uplift of, say, 0.4%. It was actually testing dark mode. But when they split this feature and looked at it at the gender level, they found that they ended up with two different results. The first is that overall, was that men liked this experiment way more than women. Actually, women were adversely impacted and had less signups from this test. Now, overall, this is still positive, right? When you combine the two groups. So shipping this is not necessarily the wrong decision. But they then did this analysis on the previous 10 experiments that they had shipped, and they found out they were all biased in exactly the same way. This is pretty bad. You've got 10 experiments in a row that have all improved the user experience for one gender at the expense of the user experience for another gender. Overall, you're up, but this is bad because cumulatively, your product is now less successful for half the population. Essentially, the ideas you're testing are biased, and you should be thinking about how to diversify your testing strategy and find opportunities to balance this out more. The area that this is more commonly used, though, is looking at technical bugs. For example, what if your new feature doesn't work on some browser types? Or what happens if it doesn't work on older Android devices with small screens? You may have a 1% win, but by fixing these bugs, you can increase it to 1.1, 1.2%. So to do this right, because there's a lot of attributes, you'll want to run automated decision-making across a set of attributes while correcting for type 1 errors due to the multiple comparison problem. All right. This is the last technique I'll talk about. It's called experimental meta-analysis. After you've run dozens, if not hundreds of experiments, you actually have a small data set containing causal observations. And there's a lot you can do with this. And this is an area we're still exploring and don't have all the answers. But we do want to surface data and are exploring how this works. For example, what if you want to show the relationship between metrics? We could have a data set of, say, 20 experiments that all measure metric X versus metric Y. And plot them as a scatter plot and draw a line of best fit. Is it possible that this can help us understand a causal relationship between these two metrics? Is it possible we can use one metric as a proxy for another metric in experimentation? Because maybe one metric is easier and quicker to read out. This also helps you estimate what movements have been historically possible. Is a estimated 5% lift on revenue a reasonable estimate? Well, we can look at historical data and see what the batting average has been. This is my conclusion slide. I did a whirlwind tour through a bunch of solutions to specific problems in A/B testing. The key takeaway for me, and there's not really a single theme, but there is a theme that there's a lot you can do. But I do want to leave you with one lasting thought that I feel is really important. While these are really cool, and the reason why you attended this talk, stats engines don't build culture. I find that if you're running an experimentation program, there are some folks who tend to overthink experimentation, but that actually becomes a blocker. It's almost always better to run an experiment, collect the data, rather than talk yourself out of it. So do remember that. This concludes my talk. I want to thank you for watching. If you want to hear more from me, please follow me on LinkedIn. That's the best way. I've got the URL up there. If you want to get in touch, I also have email and my Twitter accounts. And if you don't care much about experimentation and may have attended the wrong talk, but you like dogs, I highly recommend visiting statsig.com/pets. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. What a wonderful presentation. Before we do dive into our Q&A session, I just want to remind everyone that now is the time to get straight from the source insight from Tim. So don't be afraid to submit your questions if you have any. And additionally, we understand if you need to run, just know that today's session is being recorded and will be emailed to you within the next 48 hours. And as Tim said, if we don't get to your question or comment today, you can always connect and follow up with Tim via LinkedIn, which is still on screen and it will be in the chat shortly for you. Okay, so we got some great questions. So with our remaining time here, let's get to a few of these. The first question, Tim, is coming from an anonymous attendee, and they're saying, in my company, I keep getting pushback that during peak seasonality or during special marketing promo periods, user behavior is totally erratic, and so we should not run tests during these periods. Any counter argument against this?
There are a lot of businesses in this world where promotional periods or sales periods are actually very critical to the company's success. An easy companies to think of is like Amazon and Walmart. Where would retail be if there were no such thing as sales or like Black Friday sales or things like that? And so if you find that your business is actually dependent on being successful during these periods, you need to be experimenting and understanding how your users behave in these periods. I wouldn't describe it as that the users are erratic during these periods. I think users are just behaving differently, and that's something you want to measure and optimize for. So I think while this may be true if you're one type of company where maybe a sale happens just once a year and it doesn't actually drive that much business, then it's probably not a situation you want to optimize for. But if you are Amazon and Walmart, you absolutely want to optimize those periods. Start learning how your users, what deals and promotions and what website layouts and designs work for under such circumstances, because you want that to be repeatable and to be able to keep making these periods more effective.
Thank you, Tim. And if there are any follow-ups to anything we're chatting about here, feel free to share those with us as well. Okay, we have another question coming in from Anonymous. Um, how might you adjust the experiment runtime from power analysis with Cupid in mind, i.e., how do you know how much shorter the experiment needs to run if we implement Cupid?
That's a great question. I find it's one thing to really take into account is that a power analysis isn't a precise calculation. It's really an estimate. So it's okay to be off by a decent margin because what is 5% of users more or 5% less doesn't impact so much whether you have to run the experiment an extra day or not. With that in mind, you can actually still run in a power analysis taking into account Cupid. If, for example, you have some very simple the power analysis formula uses an estimate for standard deviation, and you can actually understand, and that basically lets you know that's the standard deviation of your metric of your ability to measure here. You can get this number, the standard deviation, done with Cupid applied. So essentially look at your user base outside of an experiment and just see whether some attribute or historical data you are using, whether it is predictive of future data, and if so, how much so. You can get the standard deviation or variance estimate with Cupid applied under the situation. You can think of it like a simple AA test. And you use that in your power analysis, and that should give you, if it is actually effective, give you a reduced number. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, if there are, again, any follow-ups, go ahead and feel free to share those. Moving right along here. Question coming in that says, thank you for the presentation, Tim. What are some of the ways to measure metric sensitivity before launching an experiment?
there's sort of two approaches you can take. One is understand whether the metric is actually reliable to measure. So understanding the variance of the metric. If you have something that's just fundamentally high variance, and the way high variance is relative to its value. So you take the standard deviation divided by the mean. If you get a number that's really large, it's fundamentally a high variance metric, and that'll affect your ability to get a precise estimate. But the second one is even if you have a really high precision metric, sensitivity is still your ability to measure a true effect. And the question is that there are some metrics that are very stable and don't move. One that I keep running into is retention rate. Retention is notoriously a very stubborn metric to move. If you can move it 1 to 2%, that's usually like a big deal. So the best way to analyze whether a metric is stubborn and doesn't move and has low sensitivity is you can look at historical experimental results, or you can just look at its day-to-day variability. That does it actually move due to things like seasonal effects, or is it just stable and doesn't really move? If that's the case, it's probably not a great metric in experimentation.
Thanks, Tim. Our next question reads, heterogeneous segmentation is important. However, many times I see stakeholders wanting to use endogenous segments related to the treatment assignment. This creates selection bias. So is there a convincing way to surface the problem?
That That's an interesting question. You don't want to if it has an endogenous effects that kind of invalidates the results and the analysis that you are about to perform. And so I try to stay away from that as much as possible. It's just fundamentally, if you are bringing in the treatment effect into how you're carving it up, yeah, you're going to end up with biased results. And I don't think you can trust that in any way, shape, or form. Usually you'll want to rely on things that are factors that are pre-experimental. So I think I'll leave that answer as is there.
Thank you, Tim. We have time for a couple more here. Um, Someone has a sort of technical question. They say a lot of the times the variable being tested is not normally distributed. In such a case, can we say that the treatment effect on a transformed, say, log transformed data can be used to derive a conclusion for the actual data?
Ah, I love this. Okay. If your underlying data is not normally distributed, it doesn't matter. The reason why is because of the central limit theorem. Central limit theorem says your estimate for a stat like the mean, that estimate it converges to a normal distribution, irrespective of the underlying distribution. That's true whether you have a binomial metric, whether it's uniform, whether you have something that's even skewed. There's usually just a question of how long it takes to converge. The second part of that question is around what happens if you do a transformation like log transform. Usually you'll do such a transformation if you have, for example, a highly skewed metric. The thing I don't like about log transformations is that while it does a good job of being able to pick up real lifts, I find the results are not interpretable. If you get a if you get a lift in the log transform of a metric, and let's just say it's pretend it's revenue. You can't tell if you turned 1 penny into $1 or you've turned $100 into 1,000. And where that matters is where if you actually are increasing one end of the spectrum and decreasing the other, it's not really fair to compare that in log units. So I find that while log is kind of a great mathematical technique for normalizing your data, it's pretty bad in experimentation in terms of just being able to produce results that matter and are interpretable.
Really interesting. Thanks, Tim. We do have a follow-up coming in from Amber in regards to your recent response talking about metric sensitivity. How would you go about an experiment for a metric that does have high variance? Any kind of standards there?
Um, the high variance metrics are a little tricky. One is that some of the most important metrics that people care about are high variance. Things like time spent and revenue are notorious for high variances. So that's why people are insisting that those be included in experimental results, but it's really hard to get precise readouts on them. There's a few tricks you can do, and I am planning my next blog post on this topic. But for example, in revenue, you can actually decompose revenue into two parts. So revenue in experimentation is actually average revenue per user, but you can decompose that into what percentage of your user base are payers. And so that turns it into a one or a zero metric as a binomial distribution, which is low variance. And then the second part of revenue is out of the people who are paying, what is the average revenue per payer? And that's a metric where, because we've removed the zeros, we have reduced the variance of that metric as well. So, and the cool thing is if you actually multiply those two metrics together, percentage of users that pay times the average revenue per payer, you get the metric you care about, which is revenue. So that's one way to decompose a high variance metric into two sub-metrics that are lower variance. Another way is you can look at, you can do something like, hey, what percentage of my user base are paying more than $10? That's another one where that becomes a binomial metric as well. So there's different tricks you can do with lowering the variance of the metric in ways that are correlated to what you actually care about. That's a great question and a topic I love. So thank you for asking.
Um, Great. And it looks like we have time for maybe one more, maybe two. I want to ask this question coming in from Anonymous. Do you think product managers without a science or research background can learn how to conduct experiments on their own? This has been kind of a debate at our company given the complexity of experiments. And, some people say we should be collaborating with research experts, but they think, we could probably learn to do them on our own. So what do you think, Tim?
I think absolutely yes. In fact, I am a big advocate for making sure experimentation is not gatekeepered behind just data scientists and data people. This technique is so powerful that everyone at the company really needs to understand how experimentation works and should be participating in the process. This is not an opinion I've always shared, but one of the things that was sort of an epiphany or a mind-blowing moment to me was when I was at Facebook, I would see like even interns, engineers set up an experiment and run them and execute them and interpret them. And there's some ways that they had to learn. By the way, the tooling there was good enough that that could be done. Um, but but also they had watched other engineers do it and learned the process and learned how to interpret what a confidence interval means, how to identify a good result, how to set up hypothesis and scorecard correctly. So this doesn't require advanced training. It requires a little bit of learning and shared best practices within a company. And I view that as the role of data scientists at a company, is how to make sure that the whole company is participating in this process and is doing it correctly, rather than gatekeepering off this powerful technique.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tim. And I know we have quite a few questions we didn't get to this afternoon. So please, again, feel free to follow up with Tim after this webinar, and I will make sure he has all of these questions in hand as well. With that, that is just about all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much to Statsig for sponsoring this webinar. And thank you, Tim, for such a wonderful, valuable presentation today.
Thanks for having me here. I really enjoyed this presentation and the questions were awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of you for attending. I would like to encourage you to participate in the survey that will pop up in your browser after this webinar closes. We're also all about feedback here at Data Science Current, so we would love to hear from you. Thank you again for attending. My name is Tara, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.